I actually gave this as a homily last year at our school. It's a story that I learned about when I started teaching a women in antiquity class, and I really enjoy it. I think it's a great tale. And it's just super engaging, and it's got all kinds of crazy twists and turns. So it's a story of attempted martyrdom. We get this story from a work called The Acts of Paul and Thecla. We hear about this from multiple sources. It was a circulating text, much like many of the books of the Gospel and the New Testament in the Roman period. It is what you might think of as like the Acts of Paul, right? That's actually in the New Testament. This is its sort of spin-off, right? They take one character and then they start a whole new series starring Thecla. It's a really interesting, if you don't know a lot of biblical history, the Acts of Paul and Thecla are considered an example of New Testament Apocrypha. And sort of just to mention briefly what that is. Apocrypha there's some for the Old Testament, some for the New Testament. They're ancient works, so many of them are written around the exact same time that books that are in the Bible are written. So in the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era, but for various reasons, they were deemed not to be canon, right? So at some point in time, the church or leaders of the church decided that these were not meant to be the books read by everybody in the study of Christianity. This was a sort of informal decision. Books circulated together and kind of different church fathers created groupings. And it seems pretty clear by the 4th or 5th century that the canon, the New Testament as we have it today, was pretty much set, but it actually wasn't formalized until the Council of Trent in the 1600s that we have those books. And if you look at other religions that are offshoots of Christianity, so your Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox, Syriac Christianity, Armenian Christianity, Ethiopian, they actually include different texts that we don't have in Western Protestant or Catholic traditions. I also really, really like this text because it goes against a lot of the things that I grew up reading when I raised as a Catholic. And that is these sort of, what comes off to me as an overwhelming priority of men in the Christian tradition. You get a lot of these quotes from Paul himself, most of them, about not allowing a woman to teach and the woman submitting to her husband, and not even being allowed to speak in churches. And so one could speculate that the reason that the Acts of Paul and Thecla did not make canon is precisely because it sort of contradicts this idea of what early church leadership would look like, which is a male-dominated society. But even with all of that in there, it's worth pointing out there are moments within the New Testament that show women as leaders in the church and women as important figures in sort of delivering the word of the Lord. And probably the best example of this is from Mark 16, where we find Jesus rising from the dead and appearing first to Mary Magdalene. And it's Mary Magdalene who goes and tells the disciples that Jesus has been resurrected. And this glimmer of female voice, I think, is really a great example. And we get this idea that without women preachers, we would never know the resurrection of the Lord. So there is this underlying idea within Christianity of the importance of the female voice. All right, so that's all this background information. Let's actually get to the story itself of Thecla. So Thecla is a young, probably about 18, noble woman living in a city in the Roman Empire. This would be in modern day southern Turkey. It's a town called Iconium. And she lived there with her widowed mother, who had arranged a marriage for her, which is very, very typical. So she was not yet married, but she was engaged to another wealthy man in the town. And one day, Paul came to the town and actually started preaching at her neighbor's house, which was a very common thing for Paul to do. He sort of went around to these communities and gave sessions in houses. So while he's preaching the words of Jesus at this house, Thecla happens to hear as she sits by the window, and she becomes enamored with his words, just sort of completely taken by them, saying things like, blessed are the pure in heart. Blessed are they who keep their flesh undefiled. The idea of virginity is very important in Thecla's interpretation of Paul and Thecla following Paul. Blessed are the temperate, and blessed are they that abandon their secular enjoyments. And Thecla really took these words to heart, so much so that apparently, what was that? Okay, great. So much so that apparently she gives up, she sits by the window and stops eating and drinking, and her mother's worried, and her fiance comes by and he can't get her to talk to them. So he goes to the governor and he actually charges Paul with a crime, a very typical one for religious leaders, corrupting the youth. He's making the women not want to marry their husbands and the young men not to get married. So Paul is brought before the governor and he is in prison. And while he is in prison, Thecla goes and falls before him. She actually bribes the jailer to sneak into the jail and listen to his words. Her mother finds her there and her husband finds her there, and they bring her in front of the governor and they say, command her to marry this man, command her to follow her family's wishes. And he asks her again, and she refuses to even answer. And so after all of this, her mother says, let the unjust creature be burned. Yes, let her burn at the stake for not following my rules. So strict parenting there. And that's exactly what they try to do. So they take her to the arena, they set up the pyre, tie her to a stake. And when the people try to light the fire, a huge flame erupts, but it doesn't even touch her. There's a great eruption and a cloud from above pours down huge quantities of rain and hail, extinguishing the fire, and Thecla survives unscathed. Well, at this point, obviously, that sort of strikes a chord, and so the governor lets her go. She leaves her family, her ex-fiance, and she heads off to follow Paul. And Paul accepts her and takes her with him on his journeys as they go to the town of Antioch, which is right on the border with modern-day Syria. And when she enters the town of Antioch, a rich nobleman named Alexander sees her and falls in love with her, or so they say. Basically wants to get with her. And we actually hear that because he was so powerful, he just grabbed her in the street and kissed her. And she was not having this. So she pushes him, she tears his coat, she throws the crown off of his head and made him appear ridiculous before all the people. So this is not something that a stranger, a young woman, should be doing in a Roman city with one of its leading nobilities. So that guy goes to the mayor of the town and says, let's feed her to the lions. And so, of course, they do that. So they get everybody together, they put them in the arena, and they let out all these lions and bears. And a she-lion, the fiercest of all, went and actually ran over to Thecla, licked her feet, and then started attacking the other animals. So first a she-bear goes at her, and the she-lion meets him and fights the bear and tears it to pieces. And then a he-lion, a male lion, goes after the she-lion, and they fight each other to the death, and they both kill each other. And just as a side note, this was actually really typical in Roman executions. You would gender your animals so that female animals killed female prisoners and male animals killed male prisoners. So now the lions and bears have been killed, so they let out a bunch of other animals to kill her. And she's just standing there, nothing's going afterwards. She prays, and then she turns around, she actually sees a pool of water in the arena. I don't know why. She's like, now's the perfect time to get baptized. So she runs over to the pool and jumps into it, saying, I'm baptizing myself. And the crowd is like, no, don't do it. Because that pool is filled with man-eating seals. And you're like, oh my God. But then All of a sudden, a lightning storm breaks out, and those man-eating seals are electrocuted. And a huge cloud of smoke goes up in the air, and the guy's like, what happened? Where did she go? Oh my God. And there, Thecla remained unscathed, right? So now at this point, like the crowd is on her side, right? Everybody's like, Team Thecla, this is insane, except Alexander, right? He got made a fool. So he says, you know what? I've got these bulls. What if we take these bulls of mine, we tie a rope around them, we tie a rope to each side of Thecla, and we send them in opposite directions, and they'll rip her apart, right? So they do that, but not only do they tie them with a rope, they actually light a fire to their genitals so that they are even more aggressive in their running away from each other and they're tearing her apart. But what happens then is that that fire jumps off and burns the rope all the way through so that once again, she's unscathed. And at this point, the mayor comes over. He's like, who are you? I've got to let you go. And she replies, I'm a servant of the living God, a believer of Jesus Christ. And for that reason, none of the beasts could touch me. And so he's like, all right. And she goes on her way. She leaves all of that behind. And she goes once again to follow Paul. And she comes before Paul with a huge gathering of people that she's brought with her from Antioch. And he says that she should go out and preach the word of the Lord, that she could baptize people and preach Jesus's teachings. And we actually hear that when she went to go see him, we get this wonderful example that she dressed herself in the habit of a man and went to him in Myra in Lycia. So what I love in this story is that time and time again, we see sort of Thecla pushing back against the expectations of society and her role as a woman, as a good, noble woman. But in doing so, she sort of has to take up this male masculine identity. And people will point to this as one of the early examples of cross-dressing, right, in the ancient world. She actually goes with a group of followers to to a cave outside of Cilicia, another city in southern Turkey. And this was very typical for early churches in the Christian movement. And there she lived out her days, where she had a number of female followers that would flock to her as she could heal. She was credited with healing the sick and other sort of miracles. And she became a beacon for women across the Roman Empire to eschew their families and their obligations and live this life of chastity in this cave, serving the poor and defenseless. So she is credited by a lot of early church fathers as being an apostle and a proto-martyr, if you think she's just the generation removed from Jesus and the apostles. So she's a very early figure in the Christian movement. There's a series of acts of martyrs that come out of the Roman period from all the Christian persecutions, and she's our earliest example. She kind of sets the tone for how these later execution stories are going to play out. We do know she serves as a model for many Roman women. They credit her with their devotion, with their confirmation in Christianity. She's built as this role model of asceticism. So this idea of being celibate, sort of not drinking, not indulging, really living that minimal life, withdrawn from society. And she does have a feast day, September 24th. We hear that with her dedication and image, she started a following of women across Asia Minor and Egypt, a sort of early feminist movement where they saw her as a patron of empowerment for women. She preached to men, she baptized herself, and all these things that were normally supposed to have done only by men get taken up by Thecla. And as other women in the community see this, they sort of want to be a part of that movement. She has dozens of chapels. In Syria, she has over 40 churches. She has a few in Europe, one in El Salvador and Canada. And she even has a couple of Roman Catholic churches in the US named after her. The picture on the bottom right is actually her church in Syria which is supposedly where she died. It's a nunnery, Greek Orthodox nunnery. And we hear that in just an interesting modern example of what's going on with Thecla is that 12 nuns were actually captured there by Al-Qaeda and held hostage until prisoners were released. So she doesn't make the cut. This story doesn't make it to the New Testament that we have, and you can argue a few different things. The Paul in this story, in the Acts of Paul and Thecla, is a little bit different than we see in his letters. And so a church father might argue that that contradictory representation of this early church leader is problematic. More likely, it's the fact that she's a female leader of the church. And when they come to determining the canon, there really does seem to be a pretty heavy emphasis on male leadership in that established hierarchy. And then, to add insult to injury, she actually gets removed from sainthood by the Roman Catholic Church in 1969. They had a calendar reform, and they decided to go through and remove or demote saints that didn't have enough historical background on them. And so because her historical imprint is fairly limited, she is actually kicked out of the Roman Catholic calendar and considered a demoted saint of the Catholic Church. Despite that, she is still incredibly worshipped in the Orthodox and Eastern traditions. Oh yeah, there's Pope Paul VI did that kicking out. Overall, I think she's a great example of this early female leader in the church who sort of goes against all the expectations that society and her family had set out for her, and does so in such a way that is meaningful to her and just has this lasting impact on those that come to know her and know her story. So it's very cool. And also has man-eating seals, and that makes it awesome. And that's all. Thanks, guys. Any questions? Susie hit the clap button. There's a clap button. Is everybody muted? Do I have to unmute you? Sorry, did I do that?
No, I think we did it individually.
Oh, okay, I was like.
Hello.
Yay, hi.
That was lovely.
Oh,
Thank
you. Thank you. Yeah, I had to re-record it for, they're doing like virtual chapel now. So our chaplain was like, oh, you did this last year. I think the middle school kids would like it. Can you re-record it for middle school? And I was like, okay.
Sure.
Why not?
Yeah, so pretty much every year that I've been here, Moltmann has come to campus. So it was funny to see that you had like a quote from him.
Yes. Wow.
And it's one of those things where, like, unfortunately, I've had a conflict every single time he's been speaking, but they talk about him all the time in our religion and philosophy department. So
big name. How are you liking teaching there?
It's great.
Yeah.
I love it. Yeah. So faculty are amazing, and the students are outstanding. And so we have a good time. It's unfortunate that we can't get together right now, but
yeah, that's really sad. Yeah. Okay.
Well, thank you. Unfortunately, I have to run, but this was lovely.
Yeah.
With some others.
Yeah. Thanks for stopping by.
Yeah, it was good to see you.
Good to see you. Bye, Susie.
Bye.
Thanks, Anne. That was good.
Yeah, of course. How are you guys doing?
We're good.
Oh, good.
I need to listen to Matthew's part again about making that drink.
Oh, yeah. It's a good drink. I'll send you the recording.
It looks good, but I would have to do vodka.
Yeah. He would too.
Oh, he would?
Yes. You would have to do vodka too. Yeah. Well, awesome. All right. Well, the dogs are fighting, so.
Thank you again. Another interesting one.
Yeah, thank you. I like this one.
See you next Sunday.
Yeah.
Looking
see
forward
you.
to it.
I
Bye.
enjoyed it. Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, shoot. I just spilled something. Okay. Ah. I spilled. You're still logged on. It's okay. I'll kick you out.